Okay, we're going to continue. We've only got a couple more lectures before the midterm exam. Last class, I introduced you to the schism, the Reformation. There's been more than one schism in the Christian church, so I'll refer to this particular break as the Reformation because it is the biggest one and the most famous. And if you are Christian in Korea, you go to church, chances are you go to a Catholic church or some kind of Protestant church, maybe a Presbyterian, Changlo Gyohe, or a Baptist church, or maybe even a Methodist church. Most Koreans are Protestant, but some of them are Catholic too. So we talked about this in class, and it's in the book too, so I'm not going to go over what the major differences are, but basically the Catholic Church is the whole church, and it splits in half, but the Protestant church immediately splits. Some of them want to follow what Luther says. There's these old heretical guys, remember, from the 14th century, who like John Wycliffe. They're called Lollards, but they never really become a real church. The Anglicans, which are the Church of England, the Scots, not Scotch, that's a drink. Scots, they're known as the Presbyterians because they're organized by, as I said, one of the things that's different about Protestants is they don't have bishops and archbishops and cardinals and a pope, so it's less of a triangle and more of a circle. So the presbyters are these areas, and together they form a church called the Presbyterian Church. So that's why it's called that. But you could call it the Scottish Church. It's just there's more Presbyterians in the United States and in Korea than in Scotland now. So the name Presbyterian is usually what people say. One of the reasons there's so many Presbyterians in Korea is because American Presbyterians came over here and taught people about the Bible and about their version of Christianity. So that church originates in Scotland, but it's all over the world. English church, of course, is an English national church, just like the Scots. But there's a lot of Anglicans in Africa. There's more Anglicans in Africa than there are in England now. What we really want to talk about today, in particular at first, though, is these guys called the Puritans. In the textbook on page 100, nice round number, there is a little bit about Thomas More, and I will talk about him when I talk about Catholic people. So he's a good example of a very Catholic person. In the picture, you have a Puritan dad and some Puritan kids kind of hiding behind their mother. I'm not sure if that's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek by the artist, trying to show what it would be like to be in a Puritan family, but they're famous for being very strict. They don't like dancing, they don't like drinking, they don't like games, they don't like singing. It's really, they want to get the religion down to its very basic ideas, which would be eat, sleep, pray, and work. Most of us would probably want to do more than that. But actually, Thomas More sort of liked this idea too. Some old-fashioned Catholics were against all of the ceremonies and the drinking and the parties that might happen in a church. Puritans hated that, and really, you're not a Puritan if you enjoy partying. So there's a quote, something like, what did that American history professor said something like, it's a Puritan's biggest fear that somewhere somebody's having a good time. So we call that kind of person a killjoy. We will talk about the English Civil War probably next week, and during that war, the Puritans get the upper hand and start controlling the government of England. And so one of the things they try to do is cancel Christmas, which sounds like a very sad and mean thing to do, but a lot of the revelry and parties and drinking and playing that happened during Christmas, and so that was their least favorite holiday. Now Christians usually Easter is the most important sort of religiously, but in terms of celebrating religion and enjoying all kinds of good food and fellowship and friendship and family, Christmas is number one. It used to be a little bit different though. Hundreds of years ago, there was lots of drinking too much and shooting guns and running around and breaking things and rioting, disorder and things like that. So, in a sense, the Puritans did have a point. Christmas got out of control a lot, but completely banning Christmas didn't work because almost everybody looks forward to Christmas. There's just a small, there was just a smaller part of the population that really didn't want anything even close to a Catholic thing. So no nativity scene, no images even of Jesus or Mary, very, plain churches, like I said. They're sort of the most anti-Catholic you can be. Presbyterians are like the Puritans, but they don't go quite. Their churches still have some stained glass windows, and they still, keep some of their, most precious sort of ceremonies and rituals, and they don't destroy all the artwork or the literature and things that are associated with Catholics just because they're trying to get rid of everything Catholic. The Anglicans, they're in a kind of unique position. They are Protestant, but the Queen and the King of England are the head of their church. And like I said, what Henry was really trying to do is just trying to keep the Catholic Church the same and just make him the leader instead. So just kind of have like a separate church that was the same as the Catholic Church, just smaller, and only included England. But it didn't work because all these other people, including some Anglicans, we have what we call high church Anglicans, which try to be as Catholic as possible. And then you have sort of theological Anglicans, the ones that they believe in the ideas of the English church, which is to not follow the teachings of the Catholic Church, right? Queen Elizabeth, we have to get to her, we have to do this in order. So let's start by saying Henry VIII dies. He dies thinking he's still a good Catholic, which makes no sense because he's the one who's cut the church from the cuts the English church off. However, in his mind, he's still praying, he's still doing all the Catholic things. So he believes that on his deathbed, gets his Catholic rights and that he's going to heaven. However, his son, right, the youngest, he's raised by Protestant teachers, and Henry is busy with all of his different, wars and politics and things like that. So he doesn't raise any of his children. Mary gets raised kind of as a Catholic Spanish princess almost. Her English and her French is great. All of the tutors, Henry can speak 4 languages, so can Elizabeth, Edward. They're all extremely intelligent, especially talented at languages. But she grows up not expecting to be queen. So Mary's education is just be a Spanish Catholic princess. Edward, however, he's being raised to be the future king. But by then, Henry's pretty old and he's not doing any of the education. So when he dies, Edward immediately tries to make everybody more Protestant. However, he's a boy and he's not very healthy, so he doesn't last very long. He establishes some schools, some Protestant schools, what we call them grammar schools. They're like elementary schools, except much harder. You might think of them as kind of being like, high school and elementary school and middle school squished together and just accelerated so that by the time you graduate from grammar school, you're ready for university. Excuse me. That's been happening all day. Might have the plague. Edward didn't die of the plague, though. He died of tuberculosis, probably. So he caught a disease. It killed him, which meant that once Edward was gone, all of a sudden the next one in line was Mary, who is much older than him and super Catholic. So the country has been getting more and more Protestant, and now Mary is the queen. She marries the Prince of Spain, who's super Catholic. All of a sudden, she wants the entire country to go back to being Catholic. But there's several problems with this. One, a lot of people have gotten stuff and broken stuff. A lot of the priests have been changed into Protestant ministers. A lot of them have gotten married. Some of them have even, some nuns have just said, they closed the nunnery or they closed the monastery, and those men and women just go back home to their village, and sometimes their family's gone or dead and they're old, and there's no social service net for this. So once Henry takes the money and the land, he just kicks the monks and the church people off the land, and Mary doesn't have any land to give back to them. That land now belongs to Anglican nobles, and they don't really want to give it back. So she has a political problem, she has a money problem, and most of there are people who are Catholic, and there's definitely, she makes an effort to try and change the country back, but some people refuse very strongly to do that, so strongly that she threatens them that if you don't accept the Catholic religion, I'm going to burn you, throw you in jail, and burn you at the stake. And hundreds of them refuse, and she burns them. So that's where she gets this nickname, Bloody Mary. Right, Bloody Mary. And I said already, John and a few other kings, Stephen and Edward II, I mentioned some pretty bad kings. Henry VIII wasn't great either, but often Bloody Mary is chosen as the worst, partly because she burned a lot of people for what they believed, their religious belief. And that's what her reputation, that's the reputation that most people know. She also gets sick after 5 or 6 years of trying to have a child so that she could, pass, the crown to her own child. But she never gets pregnant, and she ends up getting sick, and she dies. So there goes Bloody Mary. So we're going from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic, and now Elizabeth, she's about 25. They tell her, guess what? You're the queen now. In 1558, they let her out of the tower, and all of a sudden, red-haired Elizabeth she ends up being sort of the typical Anglican type. She's Protestant, but she has a soft spot for the Catholics. She doesn't like Spain, partly because of her sister, I guess, but partly because the Spanish are super Catholic, and she's not. Like, she believes in Protestant religion, but she has a problem too. She's a queen, so she's the head of the church. So she kind of likes, the ladder, the chain of being. Like, you're here, I'm here at the top, and you are below me, and everybody down to plants and animals and rocks. She likes that idea. So she hates Puritans. She hates Catholics, and she hates Puritans. She likes moderate Protestants. So I guess this is the best way to describe what she likes the most. Again, the same history professor I like to listen to, Robert Buckles, he said the best way to describe Anglican religion is that it looks Catholic. So, all the ceremonies and all the kind of fancy dress and big buildings and impressive, and the language, still using Latin and stuff like that, although they start to use English too. Using those kind of ceremonial, ritual aspects and the appearance of sort of religious royalty. It's Queen Elizabeth loves that. She loves all the clothing, the parades, and the pageantry. It just makes her look more impressive, and the church helps her do that. So she likes that part. So it looks Catholic. Anglican looks Catholic, but thinks Protestant. So inside, she likes the English Bible. She doesn't mind people reading it. She doesn't like the Pope. She's not going to follow the Pope. She thinks that people should be able to read and think about the Bible themselves, and that she is she's understanding of people's reasons for wanting to participate in the church. So English society, Catholic society, still is kind of stretched out, where there's super rich and the super poor, the majority. But English society, as I told you, from the 14th century, there's a lot of people moving up, and there's a lot of people in the middle, and Queen Elizabeth is smart enough to make those people happy. So the Anglican Church becomes kind of a mixture of Catholic and Protestant, but it's really just a little bit Catholic at the top, and the rest of it is pretty Protestant. She doesn't like too much ritual and ceremonies. Sometimes she says, get rid of all these candles. There's too many candles. It's just a typical thing. Chants and candles and Latin singing. She wasn't into that. So she becomes the perfect moderate religious leader, and she's the perfect moderate political leader too, because she's a woman, and most people don't want a woman. Henry didn't want a woman to be the queen, and some people wanted a king too. So she has to play a very delicate game, where she has to balance all of these, men who are ambitious and have power against each other. Because if she pushes too hard, she might get resistance simply because she's a woman. And she has the same problem as her brother and her sister, because her dad, Henry VIII, spent all of their grandfather's money and all the church's money, and left the three children broke. So she's constantly got money problems, and when they have to fight a war, they need money, and she has to find ways to make money. We'll talk about that in class a little bit, how clever she is with her politics and with her finances. But generally, Elizabeth just tries not to spend any money. Her technique is get other people to buy me stuff, and somehow it works out. She invites herself over to other people's castles. That's a good way to get a free dinner, right? And entertainment. Now, rolling back the clock, remember, this is a cultural studies class, so this is the 16th century here. Right? But Henry's at the beginning. Good old Henry VIII. He's operating at the beginning of the century, and Elizabeth is queen for 40 years. So by the time you get from Henry VII to Henry to Mary to Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, it's 100 years. It's over 100 years. Thomas More is born in Thomas More here. He is born in 1478, so he's dead. Before Elizabeth is even born, he gets executed. The reason he gets executed is because he supports Catherine. When Henry wants to get divorced with Catherine, Thomas More says no. The Pope says that's not a good idea, and you should stay within your marriage, and you should ask for, if the Pope says no, you should do what you have to do. Like the Pope literally sends him a letter and says, I can't cancel your marriage, but do what you have to do, and I'll just, ignore it. But Henry refuses because he is a very religious person and he wants a real divorce. So Thomas More quits. And when Henry gets rid of Catherine and marries Anne, he requires everybody to make a promise that they will follow him instead of the Pope, and that he is the head of the church, not the Pope. Thomas More refuses to do that, and even though he's the royal chancellor, he's a lawyer, he actually was friends with Henry for years, trusted advisor, Henry kills him anyway. He's more famous. He's famous for that, for being sacrificed, but because he refuses to change his religion. He refuses to be. He would rather die than not be Catholic. He's famous for that, but he's even more famous for the book he wrote, which is called Utopia. So you've probably all heard this word utopia before. That comes from Thomas More's book of the same name. It just goes to show you how powerful English has become after, Thomas More writes Utopia in Latin, and eventually he translated into English. Not eventually, not too long after. He writes it in Latin so that all the academics and the educated people from other countries can read it too, across Europe. And then he writes an English version for the English people. And he's pretty much the last, great English writer that comfortably writes in Latin. Sir Isaac Newton does, but he's kind of a mathematical science genius. I don't know if he counts as a fluent writer. But anyway, he writes the Principia Mathematica 200 years later, almost, in Latin, so that all the other geniuses who use Latin can read it, and nobody else can, but nobody can understand his theory of gravity back then anyway. It takes a special education for somebody to know it anyway. So the language of science is going to eventually become English, and French, but that's still hundreds of years off. The language of literature in England, though, was always French since the Norman conquest. English literature was French, and they almost had French literature in Anglo-Norman literature in French before the French did. So it was a very kind of strange situation with French literature coming out of England and Normandy and France and Aquitaine at the same time. But by this point, as you can see, I call this Shakespeare and Friends. These are not Shakespeare's friends. I haven't really got to that point yet, but we're going to talk about that in class or in the next lecture, actually. Maybe we'll just call it Shakespeare and Friends Part 2. That sounds like a good title for the next one, because really Shakespeare wouldn't exist without all of this happening. The moderate Protestant environment, the social mobility, the entertainment that's allowed. Puritans would never, eventually they will shut down all the theaters. This is after Shakespeare's dead, but when Elizabeth becomes queen, she loves the plays, and she actually doesn't want to pay for them herself because I told you she's a Scrooge. But there's a whole bunch of other rich people who have their own groups, and Edward, when he is king, is actually, if you're a player, if you're an actor, that's the same as being a beggar or unemployed. You're basically considered a vagrant or like a petty criminal, a thief, like a traveling circus kind of thing, just around to entertain people and cheat them of their money. But Queen Elizabeth changes all that. She encourages poetry and drama and literature of all sorts, and then maybe unsurprisingly, there's a lot of some of the best writing ever is done at the end of the 16th century. Shakespeare leading the way, but there's a whole group of them. That's why I said Shakespeare and Friends. He's just the one that everybody knows, but and the other guys aren't all his friends. They're just his. There's a group of the same age, and we don't really know why the English Renaissance happened, when it did. It's the same thing as me telling you, well, why did Michelangelo and Donatello and Raphael and all the other Ninja Turtles start doing beautiful art in the Renaissance in Italy? Why did that happen in the 14th century? How come, Botticelli and Dante and Petrarch were all writing around the same time? Part of the reason was the money in Florence, the Medicis and stuff like that. But this here is, it's just Elizabeth's sort of encouragement, not so much wealth per se, as just a sort of cultural development where art and literature is encouraged, and there's the right talent in the right place at the right time. And so this Reformation sort of goes back and forth in between like a renaissance of art and literature and a war of, religious theology. So this is all the religious and political stuff. When I see you in class, we don't have a quiz, so I'll have plenty of time to talk to you about all the other interesting things that happen, the economic things, the interesting people, and how London, the culture of London is changing, and what it's like to live in the time of Queen Elizabeth. I guess that's where, I'm not sure how much time I'm on the clock, but I think that's a good place to stop. So as usual, check out this cyber lecture, and we'll pick up from here on Thursday. Have a good day.